Um, I'm Simon Stern, president of LCH. It's my pleasure today to host this joint session with Sal Nicolazzo and Renisa Mawani. So we'll go in that order. I'll introduce each speaker just before they speak, and we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. Sal Nicolazzo is a scholar of law and literature in the 18th century British Empire and Atlantic world, with a particular focus on how legal and literary tropes, practices, rhetorics, and genres taken together can reveal new histories of colonial racial capitalism and its implication in the material histories of gender and sexuality. Sal is an assistant professor at UC Davis. Their first book, Vagrant Figures, Law, Literature, and the Origins of the Police, was published by Yale in 2021. It argues that restoration in 18th century vagrancy law across the British Empire reveals the narrative, textual, and rhetorical practices that shaped the purview and scope of policing in the Anglo-American legal sphere before the establishment of the modern police force. Their current research examines risk, property law, and speculation as forms of future orientation that 18th century racial capitalism constructed, juxtaposing phenomena such as maritime insurance, private policing, and land speculation with literary registers of temporality, including verb tense, novelistic experiments in cause and effect, and poetic expansions of time and space, such as the loco-descriptive prospect. In addition, Sal is currently co-editing Volume 4, the 18th century volume of the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Trans Lives. And Sal's talk today is called Sweetness is Power. Please take it away.
Great. Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, there we go. So thank you. What I'm offering today is the conceptual framework that's informing the archival research that I am just now currently in the middle of. I'm in London researching English Caribbean legal codes in the mid to late 17th century. And what I'm tracing is the emergence of whiteness as an embodied status. And so the piece I'm presenting sets up some of the research questions that I'm pursuing in the archives right now. And I'm hoping this, I'm excited for this conversation to shape some of that research as it is ongoing. So, oops, sorry, 1 second. There we go. Okay. Despite its title's nod to the past, Richard Ligon's true and exact history of the island of Barbados is resolutely future-oriented. It's a text that seeks to bring futures into being for its author, its readers, and the plantation society it describes. Writing from debtor's prison in around 1653, Ligon hoped that his written account of Barbados could do what his travel to Barbados did not, return him to the financial solvency and gentlemanly status to which he believed himself entitled. As Cassandra Smith notes, by the time of the text's eventual publication in 1657, Ligon could market himself as an expert eyewitness and who could offer his observations of Barbados as a blueprint for future English settlers in the Caribbean, especially in the newly acquired colony of Jamaica. As Karen Ordall Cooperman has suggested, Ligon is a projector, a writer in the mode that David Alf characterizes as a kind of speculative fiction, which, like the novel, quote, invited readers to explore hypothetical worlds for immediate pleasure and the promise of moral or monetary gain, end quote. Meanwhile, as Susan Scott Parrish has noted, Ligon joins natural history with political philosophy, rendering Barbados a laboratory for experimental social and political thought in the profoundly indeterminate moment of the interregnum. And so when Ligon closes his history with a detailed accounting of how much capital and which specific resources a prospective plantation owner would need in order to establish a profitable sugar plantation on Barbados, we can read this moment not only for the empiricism it claims to offer, but also for its profound fictionality. Ligon's particular choice of rhetorical form in this portion of the history is one whose claims to verisimilitude are particularly seductive: numbers, accounts, and elsewhere, charts and blueprints. However, as Jennifer Morgan, Jessica Marie Johnson, and Catherine McKittrick have shown, numeracy itself, the rhetorical veneer of quantitative transparency that adheres to data presented as such, is both materially and epistemologically foundational to the idea that human beings could become commodities subject to market logics of exchange. As Saidiya Hartman has so foundationally argued, that taking a stance of critical fabulation in relation to the records of enslavement reveals the profound fictionality of the records themselves. And so this, therefore, is speculative fiction. An acre of good cane will yield 4,000 pound weight of sugar, and none will yield less than 2,000 weight, but we will take a medium and rest upon 3,000 weight, upon which we will make our computation and set our price upon the sugar. This passage does not describe any specific actually existing acre on the island. Rather, he extrapolates his experience with multiple sugar plantations probabilistically and forms an average that provides a statistical basis for the price his reader can expect his sugar to yield should this reader invest in a plantation in the future. The numbers on the page echo an account book's claims to represent actually existing money, even as the plantation these numbers describe is wholly hypothetical and fictional. Through the rhetorical genre of the account, Ligon leads his reader to connect the columns of numbers printed on the page to a sense of visible reality as figured through an imaginable setting in a story that unfolds over time. Quote, "Now you see what a vast revenue this little spot of ground can produce in 22 months," end quote. The gap of 22 months that Ligon notes here also alludes to the fact that planting sugar was itself a speculative enterprise. As Russell Menard shows, Barbadian sugar plantations typically took 2.5 years from first planting to become profitable, thus rendering plantation owners highly dependent upon credit from merchants. And one of Ligon's most insistent rhetorical moves, as both the writer of a business manual and natural history, is to make this future of profit palpably present for his readers, a form of presence he aims for both in his accounting calculations and in his vivid natural historical descriptions of flora and fauna. To bring the future into the present is one definition of speculation. For instance, the anonymous collective of authors of Speculate This, which sort of theorizes speculation more generally, characterize speculation as, quote, "a modern technology for the absolute actualization of potentiality without remainder, a modern apparatus for erasing the future by realizing it as eternal present," end quote. This ability to crystallize a future as eternal present is also a prominent material capacity of the commodity Ligon extols, sugar. Sugar's use as a preservative, as Gitanjali Shahani argues, links it indelibly in the early modern English imagination with mastery over time. This association between sugar, preservation, and aesthetic durability greets Ligon's readers in the front matter of his text, as his cousin George Walsh's poem praising his work states, quote, "You candy that which does preserve the rest," end quote. Thus, it comes as no surprise that that sweetness for Ligon is an aesthetic category that often encodes a relation to time, the ability to imagine one's anticipated pleasure and profit suspended in an indefinitely speculatable future. In her foundational Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris argues that the property interest in whiteness persists as, quote, "the legal legitimation of expectations of power and control that enshrine the status quo as a neutral baseline," end quote. At the core of both whiteness as property and its ability to masquerade as race neutral is, quote, "the characterization of the unfettered right to exclude as a legitimate aspect of identity and property," end quote. Ligon, writing at the dawn of whiteness as property in the Anglo-American legal tradition, offers some insight into the emergence of two of these key features of whiteness as property as Harris theorizes it: the future-oriented expectation of power and the internalization of the property interest as if it were an inalienable feature of embodied being. Both of these crucial features of whiteness as property, I argue, are powerfully evident in an unlikely place in Ligon's repeated invocation of sweetness as an aesthetic category and gustatory, but not only gustatory sensation. As Elizabeth Anker has argued, the embeddedness of Lockean notions of individual freedom in the material history of sugar plantations opens the way into a sensory history of the seemingly abstract sociolegal notion. Quote, "Sugar, perhaps, is freedom's digestible form. If the archives of freedom are allowed to become a multisensory experience, as Lisa Lowe suggests in her insistence on conceiving archives differently, then we could argue that sugar in this sense is what freedom tastes like," end quote. And of course, the centrality of Locke to both Harris and Anchor is, I also just note that Locke is a reader of Ligon, as are many late 17th century natural philosophers and thinkers. His text circulated pretty broadly. However, while Anchor, like nearly all commentators on the history of sugar, characterizes sweetness as a deceptive pleasure that masks the violence of its production, I want to suggest that Ligon's repeated invocations of sweetness actually upend some foundational assumptions about the sensory category that we have inherited from his historical moment. The sweetness of sugar is difficult to conceptualize without tautology. Sugar is definitionally sweet, and our current capacity to imagine what sweet tastes like is shaped foundationally by the consumption of sugar over many centuries. Sidney Mintz, in his classic Sweetness and Power, historicizes this tautology by arguing that sweetness's emergence in Western cuisine as a powerfully distinct and richly significant taste, temporally and culturally separated from the rest of the meal, is also the story of the rise of the sugar plantation and its centrality to the modern history of racial capitalism. Much of the vibrant, varied work on sugar that has followed Mintz is deeply indebted to his insights, and yet sweetness remains easy to gloss over as a word whose meaning we think we already viscerally know. In what follows, I attempt a defamiliarization of what sweetness means in its many appearances throughout Ligon's history of Barbados. In this text, the word sweet often strays surprisingly far from its meanings that we colloquially expect it to hold: embodied pleasure, gustatory enjoyment, immediate and ephemeral gratification. Indeed, Ligon repeatedly uses the words sweet and sweetness to name relations to time. As sugar's durability relies on the extreme vulnerability and perishability of the people who harvest and manufacture it, the aestheticization of its relation to futurity helps construct whiteness as an embodied sense of entitlement to command and extract the labor, life, time, and knowledge of others. Ligon's invocation of sweetness is thus a powerful example of what Sarah Lewis Capillari terms racial tasting. If we've often thought of the making of modern race as one that increasingly renders the skin and its relation to visuality a metonym for relations to domination, subjection, and subjectivity, then reading Ligon allows us to understand, as Lewis Capillari argues, just how much the making of race also involved senses other than sight. In Ligon, whiteness emerges as a specific relation to embodied sensation that prioritizes an inward, felt, ingested, touched, and tasted sense of mastery, domination, and futurity. Ligon does not use the inchoate language of whiteness in his text. He uses the older and more established categories of English or Christian to differentiate Europeans, both free and bound, from their Black and Indigenous counterparts. But as an eyewitness to and a participant in the milieu from which the vocabulary of whiteness was emerging, he invokes sweetness as an embodied sensational experience of what I think whiteness most powerfully meant for him, especially as he composed this text while imprisoned for debt back in London in the mid-1650s. The future capacity for domination and ownership, rendered incorporable into the body like food, and thus inalienable from the body even under his present conditions of unfreedom, dependence, and destitution. Sugar and sweetness are not synonymous. As Kim F. Hall notes, there were many sources of sweetness in early modern England. Honey, for instance, is sweeter than sugar and bore its own powerful network of cultural associations with both gustatory and erotic pleasure, desire, and reward that dated back to antiquity. However, as she notes, what set sugar apart from honey in the logic of cultural prestige was its production process, its association with the technological modernity, human ingenuity, and reliance on domination that honey, as a product of nature, could not boast. As Gitanjali Shahani argues, sugar began to redefine sweetness itself as sugar's use, quote, as ornament, as preservative, as remedy, as stimulant, end quote, inflected the sensational vocabulary of sweetness in 17th century England. All of this powerfully inflects Ligon's vocabulary of sweetness, perhaps most prominently in his repeated characterization of the island's business as this sweet negotiation of sugar, often quoted but rarely analyzed in depth by his contemporary readers. For Ligon, sweetness indexes not only sugar's gustatory taste, but also its unique material properties and associations with the relations of labor and domination that produce it as a commodity. Above all, the preservational capacities of candying, alongside the transportability of sugar across oceans and the long duration between initial capital investment and a sugar plantation's profits, all inflect sugar with a privileged relation to time and futurity. And this particular meaning of sweetness, in fact, enters the text immediately upon Ligon's arrival in Barbados. As he narrates his arrival, he offers a brief economic history of the island since its initial English colonization. After describing the poor performance of the island's first cash crop, tobacco, he narrates the turn to indigo and cotton, the next developments in what Russell Menard describes as the diversified export boom that established the plantation complex, which the sugar industry would later expand and deepen. For the first, but not the last time in the text, profit takes the form of sweetness. Yet we found indigo planted and so well ordered as it sold in London at very good rates, and their cotton wool and fustic wood proved very good and staple commodities. So that beginning to taste the sweet of this trade, they set themselves hard to work and lived in much better condition. But when the canes had been planted 3 or 4 years, they found that to be the main plant to improve the value of the whole island, and so bent all their endeavors to advance their knowledge in the planting and making sugar. Here, the sweetness of trade playfully evokes sugar, as it frequently does throughout the text, but proleptically. The sweet of this trade is tasted by the profiteers of a nascent plantation complex before sugar comes to define it. Narrating retrospectively, Ligon positions sweetness as a harbinger of a future he writes from, the future in which the profits of indigo and cotton can be figured through a taste of the commodity in which those profits will later be invested. Sweetness here invokes futurity, yet elides the risk and volatility inherent in speculation, converting the uncertain possibility of future profit into a much more certain, immediate, and embodied pleasure known and experienced now. Later in the text, after his extended panegyric on the taste of the pineapple, and I'll return to that shortly, Ligon returns to sugarcane sweetness, but once again, the sweetness does not index the gustatory enjoyment he associates with the pineapple, but rather a relation to time unique to sugar as a commodity. Yet there is one brought thither as a stranger from beyond the line, which has a property beyond them all. That is all the plants. And that is the sugar cane, which though it has but one single taste, yet that full sweetness has such a benign facility or faculty as to preserve all the rest from corruption. What distinguishes sugar here is not any unique particularity of its taste. Describing its sensational experience does not require the dizzying rhetorical acrobatics that Ligon employs in order to communicate the taste of a pineapple, which he spends many pages doing. He knows his readers know the taste of sugar, and he describes it as unremarkable. It has but one single taste. Instead, for Ligon, the property beyond that of all other plants on the island is its capacity for preservation. Sugar can not only attain the stability that allows it to be transported across oceans, it also preserves other perishable foods and grants them, too, the capacity for global export. For Ligon, this is a property of sugar's sweetness. Preservation thus takes on a sensorial aesthetic quality, reminiscent of the aesthetics of incorruptibility that Chiming Yang locates in Afroben's Orinoco, and the text transformation of its vulnerable mortal protagonists into durable commodities through literary preservation and their figuration as another valuable, preservable commodity, in this case, lacquer. Using sweetness as a relation to futurity and anticipation is a complicated move, since the gustatory sensation of a sweet taste is, like all tastes, immediate and ephemeral. The formal distinction between Ligon's description of the pineapple and the description of sugarcane that immediately follows it offers a window into the difference between two deeply intertwined, yet different figurations of taste. Taste as an immediate experience, and sweetness as an aesthetic category indicating future profit and pleasure, suspended in time and preserved like a candied fruit. As Sean Silver has argued, Ligon's description of the pineapple, and especially as it finds its way into Locke's essay concerning human understanding, is a significant and deeply influential meditation on the relationship between sensory experience and representation, thus between empiricism and aesthetics. And indeed, for Ligon, the pineapple's taste must be described in rich sensory detail for his English readers because the fruit itself is so resistant to preservation and thus export. He writes, "Preserved it cannot be whole, for the rind is so firm and tough as no sugar can enter in." His narrative of the pineapple's taste emphasizes its ephemerality by narrating a sensory experience that unfolds over time. Quote, "Those tastes will change and flow so fast upon your palate as your fancy can hardly keep way with them to distinguish one from the other. And this at least to a 10th examination, for so long the echo will last," end quote. Aesthetically, this is a counterpoint to sugar. Instead of sugar's one single taste, the pineapple offers a dizzying succession of multiple sensations. Instead of sugar's portability and preservability, the sensation of tasting a pineapple is one that unfolds in and fades with time. From his introduction to the pineapple's harmony of tastes to his closing invocation of its echo, Ligon's repeated synesthetic metaphor of sound further underscores the sensation's ephemerality. Instead of any detailed description of sugar's taste or culinary use, a surprising omission, as Kim Hall argues, given the text's intense preoccupation with gastronomy and the sociability of feasting, Ligon follows the introduction of sugarcane with an extremely long, detailed technical description of the workings of the ingenio, or sugar mill. Like the description of the taste of the pineapple, this technical description of the ingenio invokes a musical metaphor, lending both a kind of equivalent aesthetic register. Quote, "So having played you a short preludium to this long and tedious lesson of sugar and sugar making, I do think fit to give you a saraband with my best touches at last," end quote. Appearing back to back in the book, and importantly, framing the book's only other set of fold-out illustrations beside the fold-out map at the very beginning, the pineapple and the ingenio form a visible and prominent contrast between the botanical and the technological, between the singular and the reproducible. And this, I won't go into it in too much detail, but the two, at least the two copies of the two editions that are in the Clark Library, the 1657 and the 73, the illustrations appear in a slightly different order, which I find interesting. The pineapple is like all the other botanical illustrations. It's the same size as all the other pages, but it's the ingenio diagrams that are a fold out. In the 1657, they appear before the pineapple. In the 1673, they appear after the pineapple. I would be curious to know if this is repeated in other copies. Just noting it because I don't yet have an argument about that. So the ingenio transforms ephemerality into preservability as it transforms the highly perishable cane juice into durable, preservable sugar through a particularly brutal regime of constant labor and time discipline. As Jarvis McInnes argues, this labor regime materializes a logic of perishability in which the preservation of fragile sugarcane relies directly on rendering enslaved laborers more vulnerable to injury and death, thus instantiating, quote, eco-ontological continuities between the precarity of Black life and the perishability of sugarcane, end quote. As Eric Otremba and Anna Tsing note, preventing the fermentation of cane juice requires the simultaneous operation of multiple labor and energy-intensive processes throughout the day and night during the harvest season, all of which are encompassed in the machinery and labor regime named as the ingenio. And of course, the experience of this labor is completely absent from the diagram that he offers. The ingenio, as Barbara Fuchs and Rebecca Mitzine argue, also condenses sugar's economic and material properties into the realm of aesthetic and cultural value, as the technological complex of the ingenio links sugar as a commodity with the notion of ingenuity, which is etymologically linked, technological invention, and the racial domination inherent to its production process. Sugar's relation to domination becomes part of its cultural prestige and appeal, signaling its consumers' power to command distant labor and ingest the energy and capacity, as Kilawazana Tompkins puts it, wrested from the bodies of the people who produce it, thus rendering, as Sarah Lewis Capillari argues, quote, certain human and more than human bodies easily consumable, exploitable, and disposable through the sweet consumption of raciality, end quote. And so what Ligon describes as the saraband with my best touches at last is a reprise of his praise for sugar's preservational capacity, but one that extends beyond the preservation of perishable foods or human bodies, as he alludes to here, along with the widespread idea that sugar was medicinal. Shortly after this comes Ligon's first, he argues, preserve us men in our healths and fortunes too. Shortly after this comes Ligon's first use of the oft-quoted phrase, sweet negotiation, which further elaborates upon this nexus of sugared preservation, embodied sensation, and the durability of property. Why may not such estates, by careful keeping and orderly and moderate expending, be preserved in their posterities to the 10th generation, and all by the sweet negotiation of sugar? Sweetness here renders an imagined capacity for future profit, status, enjoyment, and independence a felt sensation in the present. The capacity of sugar to preserve through candying links preservation of us men and our healths to the preservation of fortunes to the 10th generation, thus silently invoking white women's reproductive capacities as a partner in the promise of indefinite preservation through the inheritance of property. At the same time, as Jennifer Morgan argues, the reproducibility of racial slavery as permanent status relied foundationally on rendering, quote, enslaved women's maternal possibilities a crucial vehicle by which racial meaning was concretized, end quote. In the Barbados that Ligon documented during his time there between 1647 and 1650, whiteness did not necessarily exempt one from either the harsh labor regime of the sugar plantation or unfree status. But what it did grant was exemption from permanent heritable enslavement. Thus, both time and reproduction are at the center of what whiteness meant in this early moment of its emergence. And all of these things come together in Ligon's invocation of sweetness at the nexus of preservation and inheritance of future generations. Toward the end of the text, after detailing precisely how much capital a prospective planter will need to invest in order to establish a profitable sugar plantation, Ligon poses a rhetorical question. But one will say, why should any man that has 14,000 pounds in his purse need to run so long a risco as from hence to the Barbados, when he may live with ease and plenty at home? To such a one I answer that every drone can sit and eat the honey of his own hive. But he that can by his own industry and activity, having youth and strength to friends, raise his fortune from a small beginning to a very great one. And in this passage to that, do good to the public and be charitable to the poor, and this to be accomplished in a few years deserves much more commendation and applause, and shall find his bread gotten by his painful and honest labor and industry eat sweeter by much than his that only minds his ease and his belly. The Ligon's argument here relies foundationally on a contrast between the literal sugar that is the figure of investment and metaphorical honey. Repeating a familiar trope, Ligon figures honey as spontaneously and naturally produced, requiring neither labor nor technological ingenuity, whereas sugar relies on industry and activity. Its labor-intensive production folded into its prestige, which goes by the name of sweetness. Of course, it is not the plantation owner's own pain, labor, or exertion that produces his products or his profits, but Ligon reproduces another common 17th century English rhetorical move here by folding the labor, knowledge, and inventions of many people, especially enslaved African and indigenous people, into the supposed ingenuity of the singular gentleman planter. And so in addition to the elision of the plantation's violence, this passage enacts a kind of fantasized consumption of the enslaved, an incorporation of their labor and embodiment into the planter's subjectivity, his ingenuity, thus tying gustatory pleasure and the subjectivity-making enjoyment of property under the aesthetic category of sweetness. As scholars, including Vincent Woodard, Kilowazana Tompkins, and Bell Hooks have all noted, this fantasy of consumption has a long history of anchoring races' social, material, and legal relations of domination in embodied registers of pleasure and taste. As sugar's durability relies on the extreme vulnerability of others, the aestheticization of its relation to futurity as sweetness helps construct whiteness as an embodied sense of entitlement to command and extract the labor, life, kinship, and knowledge of others. In Ligon's sweetness, then, we might glimpse an emerging phenomenological imaginary of whiteness, a simultaneously phantasmatic and embodied sense of a capacity for future sovereignty, property, and profit. This relation to preservability also shapes the archive through which we encounter it, including the preservation of Ligon's own words for our contemporary readership. I'm thinking of how Sarah Johnson remarks in her speculative and experimental communal biography of the Enlightenment polymath, publisher, and enslaver Moreau de Sainte-Marie that she experienced, quote, astonishment and anger when working directly with bibliographical materials, many once belonging to Moreau, which have managed to survive the ravages of climate, revolutions, benign neglect. I am aware that they have been preserved with more attention and care than was devoted to many of the people whose lives are chronicled within them, end quote. And so for the interest of time, I'll just very briefly conclude that the speculative and counterfactual nature of Ligon's sweetness in the context of the text composition is, I think, crucial to what the text can reveal about the making of whiteness in this particular moment. He opens the history with a frank assertion that the text was written from debtor's prison, but he very quickly sort of zooms past that and immerses the reader in Barbados. But if we read another text that he wrote at the same time, which I'll show you here, but will not go into in depth, it becomes clear how much compensatory work the memory of Barbados is doing for him. This particular screed, which you can see from the title exactly what it is, he is accusing Jane Barclay and William Killigrew of defrauding him and leading to him being imprisoned for debt. And in this, the contrast in tone is really striking. If the history portrays Ligon as a confident guide to gentlemanly sociability, the several circumstances paints a very different portrait of his life in England upon his return. He writes from this position of abject dependence, of destitution, of subordination. And so I'm thinking about sort of the importance of his memory of Barbados as something internalized. An ongoing question for me, as this is a work in progress, is how Ligon's self-perception as both white and gentleman inflects his portrayal of white indentured servants in Barbados, which he does discuss at great length, especially considering that indentured servitude was a common punishment for debt in the 17th century Caribbean. And so I'm thinking here, I'll just, here we go. Ligon, Sweetness for Ligon is a figurative avenue for internalizing a sense of capacity for future ownership, sovereignty, and power. Like the sweetness of sugar, this is a capacity that can be incorporated into his body and registered as a felt sensation, rendering the ephemerality of sensory experience a proleptic materialization of future returns on investment. He did not have a fortune to bring back from Barbados, nor did he ever own a plantation, but he did bring back an internalized and thus, I think, to him, potentially inalienable sense of a capacity for the domination of others. And this ability of this capacity to persist as imaginable, palpable, or sensible, even in his actual state of economic dependence, debt, and unfreedom, speaks to an emergent sense of the relations of labor and domination as something embodied, felt, and internalized, a sensational architecture of whiteness just before this category's increasing legal codification through the slave codes of the 17th century. Many of Ligon's friends, employers, and associates literally wrote these laws as members of the Barbados Assembly, which passed the first comprehensive slave code in the English colonies in 1661, or as powerful figures in other colonies, like his friend Thomas Modiford, who would go on to become governor of Jamaica in 1661 and oversee the implementation of its earliest comprehensive slave code in 1664. And so in Ligon's history, I think we can glimpse some of the felt sense of embodied whiteness that would inform, but is not always so explicitly recorded in the legal archives that emerged from Ligon's larger social and economic world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Up next is Renisa Mawani, professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia, where she has a Canada Research Chair in colonial legal histories. One strand of her research involves histories of colonial dispossession aimed at Indigenous peoples and restrictions imposed on, quote, Asiatic migration from China and India in particular, as conjoined and entangled colonial legal processes that are central to the politics of settler colonialism historically and in the contemporary moment. Her publications in this area include Colonial Proximities, published in 2009, and Across Oceans of Law, published in 2018, and also her current book project, Enemies of Empire, Commerce and Confinement in Colonial India, Burma, and Siam, 1914 to 1920. This book will examine how colonial officials sought to redraw and control maritime and land-based borders between India, Burma, and Siam during the World War I period and beyond. Another strand of her research, Legalities of Nature, coalesces at the juncture of science, law, and history. She's written a series of articles on law and nature through Parks and Place. A central concern has been the ways in which colonial violence has been imposed and legitimated through racial, legal, civic, and state claims to nature, identity, and wilderness. And she'll be speaking today on atmospheric pressures.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the invitation, and thank you to Sal for a wonderful talk. And I'm really interested and excited to for the Q&A. I guess I'll start by just saying that UBC is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam people, and I'm joining you today from my home on the North Shore in Vancouver, which is on the unceded territories of the Squamish people. And I'll also just preface my paper by saying that you'll see I'm working on a very different scale than the really beautiful presentation we just heard from Sal. This paper, I've been actually working on this for over a decade, and it's really an attempt to sort of think of a different conceptualization of racism. And part of it is to think about race as racism as a regime of power, or as a kind of potent current that works through and works with humans and more than humans. And so yeah, I'm working on a totally different scale, but hopefully you'll see some resonances between our presentations. Okay, let's see. Can you see that? Okay, perfect. Okay. So since the late 1990s, affect has emerged as a central concern in critical and cultural theory. Responding to limits of post-structuralism and to critiques of social constructivism, the affective turn has invited a critical rethinking of the body, particularly its mediated and relational place in social life. While some scholars have sought to distinguish affect from emotion, the term has been invoked in multiple ways to capture embodiment, bodily sensations, and feelings. For others, the turn to affect has ultimately been a return to matter. This move toward the non-representational and the material has emphasized bodily encounter, intersubjectivity, and sociality, inviting new ways to theorize the political by centering movement over stasis and by conceptualizing a porous human body rather than a closed and bounded one. And I think in many ways what Sal's presentation has really sort of alerted us to is the porosity of the human body and the porosity of the environment and the political and financial. One of the most challenging aspects of the affective turn may well be its emphasis on mobility, movement, and continual change. Affective rhythms and circulation, some have argued, are constantly in motion. Yet these modalities are constrained and even obscured through the imposition of broad theoretical concepts, including racism, capitalism, and neoliberalism. Attending to affect directs attention to microscales, to the something that is becoming, a something both animated and inhabitable, Kathleen Stewart suggests, a something that escapes and exceeds the dominant conceptual paradigms upon which social and cultural theories rely. A turn to affect, I argue, may invite new ways to conceptualize racial power as atmospheric, holding the violence of colonial extraction and exploitation directed at Indigenous, Black, and Brown peoples and at the planet, while opening more than human relationalities and imaginaries. So partly in response to the methodological challenges of the affective turn, atmospheres have generated increased attention as a productive analytic concept. Atmospheres are a kind of indeterminate affective excess, through which intensive space-times can be created, Ben Anderson argues. Atmospheres emphasize movement, they render the unseen visible, drawing attention to the embodied, felt, and sensory registers and to the entanglements between human and more than human life. The diffuse and capacious qualities of atmospheres provide a useful entry point into studying mobility, ephemerality, and the circulation of affect in social and political life. As exciting as the affective turn has been in drawing attention to sensation, mobility, and matter, what has been absent is how the colonial and the racial, not solely as the past, but as material and affective infrastructures that shape the present and future, unevenly organizes the transmission and circulation of affect. In attending to what is emergent, affect studies has not sufficiently addressed how rhythmic patterns and traces of colonial and racial violence historically might generate, constrain, prohibit, and/or nourish the circulation of affect. What, for example, is the role of European colonialism and imperialism in developing epistemic and material architectures that produce specific itineraries and circulations of affect? How might the visceral sedimentations in contemporary renewals of colonial and racial violence, as well as the fierce resistance to it, limit or propel the transmission of affect and the constellations of racial power that are patterned in old and new ways? In short, is the capacity to affect and be affected a racially mediated process? So there have been a number of race critical theorists that have emphasized how the colonial and the racial influences affect in a myriad of ways. So whereas Denise Ferreira da Silva argues that race is central to the production of Black and Brown bodies as affectable, Sarah Ahmed insists that affect and emotions do things. Their circulations align communities or bodily space with social space through the very intensity of their attachments. In Arun Saldana's formulation, racial affects are institutionalized as entire ecologies, aggregating bodies into racial formations. Notwithstanding the specificity of their arguments, what remains common to all three is that race and affect are at the level of the human body, whether individuated or aggregated. But if colonial racism accrues its meaning and force through the relationality, interchange, and in many instances, the lack of distinction between humans, non-humans, and things, then what sorts of methodological insights might we draw from the affective term? How might we rethink colonial and racial power atmospherically as an all-encompassing, dynamic, and self-organizing force, as a racially charged field that is not contained in the individual body or population, and which exceeds human corporeality by joining the sentient and non-sentient and the human and more than human? And I think many of the sort of uh, patterns and relationalities that I'm trying to sort of invoke or think about as I'm writing this are really visualized in this 1886 map of the British Empire. Atmospheres I suggest here, which have foregrounded other sensory registers and entanglements and produced alternative vocabularies, might be one way to begin addressing these questions. While the literatures on affect and atmospheres, particularly in terms of their methodological challenges, may open additional ways of breathing life into race critical theories, these fields require some racial redirection and orientation. And to do this, I turn to the work of Frantz Fanon, whose compelling and enduring insights on racism, colonialism, and affect have been incredibly influential. Fanon's attention to affect has most recently been attributed to Black Skin, White Masks, but it's in an earlier essay, Racism and Culture, published posthumously in 1967, that he offers a fascinating analysis of race and affect through brief and fragmentary remarks on colonialism's racial atmosphere. So I'm interested in reading and expanding Fanon's observations on the atmosphere to reconceptualize colonial and racial power as dynamic and mutable, as a charged field that permeates and entangles humans, non-humans, and things. And part of what I'm interested in thinking about is whether the racial atmosphere, with all its pressures, produces constellations of affective intensities, meanings, forms of violence, and openings for social and political struggle. Where might such an approach lead conceptually, ethically, and politically? After all, the atmosphere is a material struggle for life. So the next part of the paper focuses on what an atmosphere is and tries to offer a different genealogy. So, in the opening pages of The Transmission of Affect, Teresa Brennan underscores the significance of atmospheres in indexing affect. She says, "Is there anyone who has not at least once walked into a room and felt the atmosphere?" What she calls the transmission of affect, if only for an instant, alters the biochemistry and neurology of the subject, she explains. The atmosphere or the environment literally gets into the individual physically and biologically. Something is present that was not there before. It's not generated solely or sometimes even in part by the individual organism or its genes. In Brennan's account, the atmosphere is not a metaphor, it's the transmission of affect, a physical material experience that reveals the permeability between human body and its environment. So despite this renewed interest in atmosphere, the concept has a long and varied history. Atmosphere has been deployed materially and metaphorically, scientifically, philosophically, and poetically describe a myriad of natural and social phenomenon at the brink of emergence. For Matthew Gandhi, scholarly interest in atmospheres began in the late 1990s through the work of German philosopher Jens Soetgen, who claimed that an atmospheric term was taking place in European phenomenology and in cognate fields. But atmosphere, as you can see from the slide that I have here, which is from Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, has a much longer and deeper historical arc. Atmosphere was a recurring concept for Lucretius, and the term emerged intermittently in his masterful didactic poem De Rerum Natura. In his efforts to develop a materialist philosophy that moved from divine providence toward an Epicurean theory of atoms, Lucretius noted that the material impress of the atmosphere and its effects on animal and human life. And he wrote, whether we go into climates that are unfavorable to us and change the atmosphere around us ourselves, or whether nature of her own accord brings us to corrupt air or to any other affection which we are not accustomed to experience and which at its first approach may inflict us with disease, the changing atmosphere could always exert a negative force on human and more than human life. So today, amid threats of climate crisis and planetary catastrophe, and I say this as we enter the season of wildfires in British Columbia, Lucretius's observations seem especially relevant. Atmospheric fluctuations and their damaging effects, he suggests, were initiated as much by humans as they were by the forces of nature. Lucretius appealed to the atmosphere to account for tumultuous changes in the air. These changes, which are not always visible, were always palpable. They were felt through corporeal and sensory registers and were indexed over time in changing weather patterns and their effects on human well-being. And in the final section, I return to the weather as a state of atmosphere that has the greatest impact on human and more than human life. So in the mid-19th century, we see another related invocation of atmosphere, one that retains some material elements from Lucretius. In an 1856 speech, Marx recalled the atmosphere as an invisible force on social and political life. The atmosphere in which we live, he told a London audience, weighs upon everyone with a 20,000-pound force, but do you feel it? No more than European society before 1848 felt the revolutionary atmosphere enveloping and pressing it from all sides. For Marx, the atmosphere played on other bodily registers and experiences to reveal something nascent and on the brink of becoming. Though Marx is best known for his historical materialism and his collaborations with Engels, it bears remembering that he wrote a doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of Epicurus. He was also a deep admirer and enthusiast of Lucretius. For the young Marx, as Paul Schaeffer calls him, the materiality of the natural world would shape and alter the social and political one, and vice versa. These influences can be traced in Marx's subsequent writings and collaborations with Engels, and one of the most famous lines in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. Some approaches to atmosphere have retained traces of Lucretius's materialism and Marx's historical materialism to convey that something is there, something is happening, even if the force of this something is not immediately discernible. Ben Anderson views atmosphere to be a useful analytic concept precisely because it holds opposing forces in tension. He writes, it's the very ambiguity of affective atmospheres between presence and absence, between subject and object, and between the definite and indefinite that enables us to reflect on affective experience as occurring beyond, around, and alongside the formation of human subjectivity. Similarly, Kathleen Stewart argues that the critical value of atmosphere is its ability to encompass disproportionate and rival forces. She writes, attending to atmospheric attunements means chronicling how incommensurate elements hang together in a scene that bodies labor to be in or to get through. Marx was clearly aware of the indeterminable, uncertain, and changing qualities of atmosphere. Only then could a 20,000-pound force impress upon bodies and still hold the possibility of being imperceptible. From this brief foray into the recent interest in atmosphere, it's tempting to conclude that atmosphere simply just exists, that they're free-floating, in flux, and emergent. Although Stewart writes of pressure points and describes the presence to be weighted, the atmosphere in her account is in a continual state of flux and emergence. There are no habitual patterns or familiar fault lines, no sediments and residues of previous struggles and conflicts, no turbulence, no history. It is precisely the diffuse, ephemeral, and effervescent qualities of atmospheres which signal something always on the brink of becoming that renders this to be a useful concept for those seeking new ways to theorize social and political life affectively. Affects and atmospheres share similar properties. Like affects, atmospheres are diffuse, sensory, non-representational, and constantly becoming. Atmospheres, we might say, attend to the movements and mobility of affects. But if we return to the materialist and climatological arguments made by Lucretius, atmospheres do not simply exist, nor do they endure in the domain of nature. As climate research has made clear, atmospheres are being altered, destroyed through human intervention, including the colonial violence of genocide, extraction, and exploitation. And I'm referring here to the work of Heather Davis and Zoe Todd. Atmospheres in Lucretius's account are not stable but tumultuous. They respond to internal and external forces, including changes in air pressure that produce heat and turbulence. Atmospheres, we might say, can affect, but they are also affected. Sorry. So Lucretius's materialist philosophy opens one interesting way to think of the atmosphere as unstable and changing, as having an unstable and changing composition that impresses upon humans more than human and ecological life. In his extraordinary speculation on atomism, he argues that all matter is composed of atoms. For some, elements constitute the heaven, the sea, the earth, the rivers, the sun. The same elements constitute corn, woods, animals, but they're actuated and made effective by being mixed with other different elements and in different ways. The collision of atoms, their distinct shapes and patterns of movement, means that change is constant, and this is what Lucretius called the turbulence of the atmosphere. The changes in the atmosphere are not only interior through the movement of atoms, but also exterior in changes to the Earth. Turbulent atmospheres are affected by elemental, social, and political pressures. Recall that in Marx's later work, as he exchanged atoms for economics, politics, and society, the threat of revolution became an atmospheric pressure. And in the longer paper, I used turbulence through Michel Serres's reading of Lucretius to sort of as a way of moving forward. I might not get to that though, but that's just to give you a sense of where the destination ends. So how might we draw on the Epicurean philosophy of Lucretius and Marx to develop an argument of atmospheres as racial? What scales and registers of analysis become important sites of inquiry? And so it's to Fanon's atmosphere that I now turn. Notwithstanding the clear philosophical and political differences between Lucretius, Marx, and Fanon, there are several themes that run through and connect their work. To begin, all three view atmospheres to be politically charged. For Lucretius, the atmosphere is a tumultuous and turbulent encounter between particles and opposing forces. These insights reverberate in different ways in Marx's revolutionary atmosphere and in Fanon's atmosphere of violence. For all three thinkers, atmospheric pressures could be felt even if they were not often seen. For Lucretius, the atmosphere encompassed and affected human and more than human and sentient, non-sentient beings. Similarly, for Fanon, the atmosphere of violence was always more than human. Curiously, these insights have seemed to be missing in recent discussions of affect and atmosphere, yet they remain crucial to theorizing racial power. Affective readings of Fanon have questioned how race and racism surface on the body, producing emotive and corporeal responses while generating specific affective attachments. The Fanon that is most often recalled in this context is the Fanon of black skin, white masks. Yet his earlier essay, Racism and Culture, which has garnered significantly less attention than either black skin, white masks or the wretched of the earth, offers important openings to reformulate racism via affect. Written between the publication of these two widely read and circulated books, delivered as a brief address to the first Congress of Negro Writers and Artists in Paris, and eventually published posthumously in Toward the African Revolution, it's here that Fanon provocatively invokes the term atmosphere. And in the longer paper, I go into a lot of detail, reading Racism and Culture alongside and together with The Wretched of the Earth. Obviously, I don't have time to do that here, so I'll just offer some brief sort of remarks. Fanon's remarks on atmosphere are brief and few. He mentions atmosphere only once in Racism and Culture and intermittently in The Wretched of the Earth. Despite this infrequency, I read atmosphere as a generative concept, one that is especially central to understanding Fanon's formulations on the changing intensity of colonial racism. In Racism and Culture, Fanon characterizes racism to be a pervasive and mutable force. In doing so, he unequivocally rejects the teleological argument that racism is receded or diminished and that humanity has somehow progressed beyond it. Instead, Fanon urges his listeners and readers to remain attentive to its self-organizing qualities. He writes, "For a time, it looked like racism had disappeared. However, this soul-soothing, unreal impression is simply the consequence of an evolution of forms of exploitation. The mutability and malleability of racism that suggests its disappearance," Fanon argues, is most evident in the expressive shift from biology to culture. The vulgar, primitive, oversimple racism purported to find in biology, he wrote, the rational individual, genotypically and phenotypically determined, becomes transformed into cultural racism. Racism does not harden, calcify, and remain static, Fanon claims. It has had to renew itself, to adapt itself, to change its appearance. It has had to undergo the fate of the cultural whole that informed it. Racism, as Fanon presents it here, is a totalizing force. It's not a mental quirk or a psychological flaw. It's not prejudice or discrimination produced through ideology or misinformation. Racism is generated through and in turn produces an entire infrastructure of domination. For Fanon, the totalizing effects of racism are devastating. Racism not only obliterates the oppressed and the colonized, but also destroys those who enact it, individually, collectively, and culturally. He offers a glimpse of this devastation in the final chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, where racism, as he describes it, bloats and disfigures the face of the culture that practices it. It's within the context of his writings that Fanon's brief remarks on atmosphere must be situated. Recall that for both Lucretius and Marx, atmosphere captures the sensory totalizing and the fleeting. As I read it, these are precisely the qualities of racism as racial power that Fanon was foregrounding and emphasizing in Racism and Culture. Fanon describes the racist world to be passion-charged. The oppressed perceives that the racist atmosphere impregnates all the elements of the social life. Fanon's fragmentary discussion of atmosphere points to racism as old, new, totalizing, fragmentary, and mobile. He underscores racism as present, absent, mutable, and mutating at the very same time. What I see as crucial in his account and an important rejoinder to the more recent interest in atmosphere is that he conceptualizes the racial atmosphere to be a material outcome of the colonial encounter, a penetrating force that organizes social relations in racially familiar and unfamiliar ways. Although the atmosphere of racial violence persists with devastating consequences, its changing qualities afford and nurture potentialities for anti-colonial resistance. In other words, the racial atmosphere shaped by the colonial past and the ongoing present remains open to newness, change, and possibility. So in the final section, I consider these questions through the weather. In the 19th century, atmosphere had two meanings, Matthew Gandy observes. It was used to describe a mood or a feeling and was also used meteorologically to reference the layer of gases enveloping the planet. The weather is the lowest and most temporary layer of the atmosphere, and this is what impresses most palpably upon human and more than human life. This is the air we breathe. Its history exists as an archive in human and more than human bodies, Astrida Neymanis argues. And although weather is a crucial part of planetary life and often the topic of pleasantries, weather has only recently become a theme of critical and racial inquiry. And I'm referring specifically to the work of Christina Sharp, who draws our attention to the weather not as a backdrop of social life or as a metaphor, but as a totalizing climate of anti-Blackness. And it's to the weather and the atmosphere and the oceanic that I want to end. One of the most provocative and enduring contributions of the affective turn has been the pressing realization that dynamism is immanent to matter and that matter always carries the potential to self organize. Engagements with atmosphere have responded to these conceptual challenges, suggesting new ways of capturing movement, change, and interchange between human bodies and ecologies while seeking to undermine their imposed distinctions. Attending to matter, Stewart argues, demands a paradigm shift, a clearing, a space in which to clear the opposition between representation and reality, or the mind numbing summary evaluations of objects as essentially good or bad, or the effort to pin something to a social construction as if it were an end in itself. If we turn to affect and if the turn to affect and atmospheres have prevented new paradigms in cultural and critical and cultural theory, how might we widen their reach to address critical theories of racism? And perhaps more importantly, how might centering racism bring new insights to bear on the affective and atmospheric turns? So, one of the limits of race critical theories, as I see it, has been the reluctance until recently to engage with the more than human, including animals and ecologies. Scholars have frequently referenced Fanon's discussion of racial nature and animality, and particularly the settlers' use of zoological terms to account for the logic's representations and devastating effects of animalization. But what we often miss is how Fanon's writings gesture to a more than human colonial world where power gained its force by collapsing and also fortifying distinctions between different human, animal, plant species. The more than human colonial contact zone was both representational and material. It was a force field through which racial currents passed, collided, and congealed to reconfigure old and new densities of colonial power. And of course, the famous quote from Fanon is the Algerian, the veiled woman, the palm trees, and the camels make up the colonial landscape. The hostility of nature, obstinate and fundamentally rebellious, might be better harnessed as to index the affective interrelationality of human and more than human worlds as targets of French colonization and as sites of anti-colonial struggle. It bears remembering, I think, that swamps, rivers, forests, and storms were not docile elements, but powerful allies for the colonized and for enslaved people. In Christina Sharp's path-breaking book, In the Wake, she argues that weather is the totality of our environments and that climate is anti-Black. In the final chapter titled Weather, Sharp begins with multiple epigraphs from the OED. In one of these definitions, the weather and the ship are inextricably linked. The nautical meaning of weather is of a ship, to make good, bad, weather of it, to behave well or ill in a storm. Weather is determined by variable conditions such as temperature, humidity, wind, velocity, precipitation, and barometric pressure. There's something important in these maritime entanglements of waves, wind, and vessels. In De Rerum Natura, Lucretius frequently references the sea and the weather in his discussion of atoms and atmosphere. He writes, when the fury of the wind has burst the cloud, it rushes forth into the sea and excites an extraordinary agitation among the waves. For Lucretius, the sea underscored the material import of fluidity and turbulence in his writings. As I've argued elsewhere, the ship and the weather were tightly joined in racial histories of European colonization and informed epistemological, legal, and ecological thinking about the conquest of the world. So Europe's domination of the earth from the 15th century onward would not have been possible without seagoing vessels. However, it bears noting that European colonialism and the success of maritime expansion were always contingent on the weather. Trade winds, seasonal shifts, and storms, especially hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, determined when and where ships could travel. Hurricanes are low pressure systems that are activated through the evaporation of warm water from the Earth's surface. And although they're deemed to be natural phenomenon, hurricanes are not equally or evenly distributed. They disproportionately affect the North Atlantic and East Pacific. In the North Atlantic, where 11% of global hurricanes occur, these storms follow the pathways northeasterly and southeasterly of trade winds, the latter rising from the south of the equator. The encounter between these winds creates atmospheric instability, which produces powerful storms that bring devastation to sea and land. And sure enough, As we are talking, Ernesto has been classified as a level 1 hurricane. Importantly, hurricanes followed and continue to follow the same maritime routes as slave ships. The most vulnerable areas, including the Caribbean and the southern US, which are also at greatest risk of sea level rising, are regions where captive Africans were forcibly transported and violently put to work on indigenous lands. And we see how central the weather is to the economies of plantations. Typically viewed as natural catastrophes, hurricanes may be viewed as one atmospheric outcome of longer histories, including European conquest, indigenous genocide, transatlantic slavery, and the production of plantation and extractive economies. In the 18th century Jamaica, to draw one example, the importation of slaves and the production of sugar created new environmental fault lines and vulnerabilities. Erosion intensified and ecological balances were altered, historian Stuart Schwartz explains, making the effects of hurricanes and other tropical storms and of the periodic droughts ever more dramatic. The consequences of these storms were felt most dramatically among enslaved populations who were given little time for preparation and afforded little protection. White planters feared that hurricanes opened possibilities for slave revolts and anti-colonial struggles. Revolt was in the air. Storms were forms of protection. So the paper goes on to talk about Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina, and the Mississippi River. But in the interest of time, I will just offer one very brief example around the Mississippi. So Walter Johnson makes the argument that the U.S. domestic slave trade expanded during the time of abolition between 1820 and 1860, and he estimates that almost 1 million enslaved Africans were transported via steamboat along the Mississippi River. Oh, wrong one. From the upper to the lower south, steamboats allowed American colonists to challenge the river's powerful currents, but these technological innovations and the massive industries they made possible brought devastating effects. As an integral technology of racial capitalism, steamboats only intensified and expanded the violent conditions that enslaved women and men were forced to endure. As Christina Sharp reminds us, New Orleans was a place from which almost no enslaved people managed to escape. Settler theft of land, slavery, industrialization, and extraction on land and sea dramatically changed the environment. Steamboats and slave ports devastated local ecosystems, making the region more vulnerable to storms and hurricanes. This is what Tiana Bruno calls the biophysical afterlife of slavery, the ecological effects of anti-Blackness. So the loss of wetlands and marshes in the 19th century, which only expanded in the early 20th century, some argue, was laid bare with Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was, of course, not a natural disaster, but was the effect of colonization and slavery on human and more than human ecologies. Given the racial devastation that became visible in the days, months, and years following, how could Katrina be viewed as anything but racial? And yet it was. And Sharp and Henri Giroux give us a really detailed explanation of what that looks like. But I want to sort of just impress upon the importance of weather as meteorological, affective, and material. And to remind us that these weather systems are part of a racial atmosphere that encompasses past and present in ways that resist chronology and teleology in the way that Fanon was writing about racism. They're constantly in flux, connecting human and more than human worlds and but also engendering creativity and inventiveness that may open other ethical and ecological imaginaries. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for those wonderful talks. I'm sure people have questions, and I think there was a hand raised before, but I thought I might first just see if either or both of you have questions, or maybe a question for the other one before we turn to the audience. Please.
Yeah, I have a question for Sal. I absolutely loved your paper. I can't wait for the sort of bigger project. But one of the things that I was really curious about is, so Ligon's history is written as the true and exact history. And, you know, in some ways, what you presented sounds like a kind of mythical projection of bourgeois whiteness in perhaps in contrast to the white indentures that he was also writing about. But when you were speaking, I was wondering about climate and how it affected, or how it enters into the text, and whether it enters as a kind of force that rendered white plantation owners and overseers, and also plantation futures, as vulnerable.
Yes, I was thinking about this during your paper. I didn't have time to get into it, but it's very much a natural history. A lot of it, climate is everywhere. He is very interested in, he pays a lot of attention to ecologies, which of course he likes to tell them as kind of these like royalist allegories of political theory. So the forest becomes a figure for like how the smaller trees are grateful to their sovereigns. But I mean, the thing that, so yeah, he's absolutely vulnerable in that he has to leave in 1650 because he gets sick. And like many 17th century and later English colonists, he attributes the illness to the climate. So that's absolutely there. And of course, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about so much during your paper was the fact that, he was there 1647 to 1650, but this wasn't published till 1657. And by the time this was published, his portrayal of like the forests on the island was completely outdated. It was totally deforested by, I think, around 1660. And there are letters from his buddy, Thomas Modiford, around like 1660, 1661, basically saying like, the island is totally deforested. The soil is exhausted. It's much less fertile than it was. The weather has changed because of the deforestation, which is all, they've cut down the trees to feed the sugar mills. So they absolutely register this as sort of not as a limit to the colonial project, of course. What they see it as like, this is why we have to colonize other islands, because we've worn out this one, let's move on to the next. But yes, climate is everywhere in the text. So I really appreciated your attention to sort of the disruptive possibilities of climate. Yeah. And I wanted to, and I guess, okay, since I've been asked, I was like, oh, where do I even start? I want to ask a question. So many. I'm wondering, okay, so yeah, this is a big question. Um, in your meditation on, affect and the affective turn, I mean, I'm sort of curious, like, do you see affect as continuing to be a useful category of analysis for thinking about power and the sensory, and especially sort of beyond the human? Um, if so, like, does affect need to change as a concept? And again, forgive the giant question, but I'm genuinely curious, like, what do you think of it as a category? Do you find it useful, or do you feel that looking at atmosphere means that you need new categories to think with?
Thanks. I think that's, I mean, I think, so when I first started working on this paper, I mean, I think uh, it was really a response to the sort of affective turn and this sort of burgeoning of scholarship on affect, which I thought was incredibly limited in so many ways. So on the one hand, I felt like the sort of representational and discursive sort of vocabularies were also limited. And I did see some potentiality in affect and discussions of affect, but I also just, part of the problem I felt was that there wasn't enough or any attention to questions of colonialism and racism. It's as though affect is just kind of universal, right? And so I do think that it's an incredibly important set of sort of registers to think about power, and to think about power beyond intentionality as as a kind of effect, right? If we think about colonization, and as a sort of the ways in which Europeans characterized it as a kind of beneficial project of bringing, the natives into the present and the future. I think that affect is a really huge part of that. Um, I will just say that I've been working for the last few years with Antoinette Burton, and Samantha Frost is a political theorist, and we have an edited volume coming out called Biocultural Empire. And part of that is really a way to think about the ecological, political, and affective as kind of interspersed as opposed to separate. And it is an attempt to really write against this idea of the, Western liberal sovereign subject as an unfeeling and unaffected subject as well. So I do think that there is a lot of, possibility, and but I think that there needs to be a recalibration, which is part of what this paper is attempting to do. We'll see. The first time I presented it, like 13 years ago, I was laughed at. So just saying.
Laughed at, that seems a bit much. Nicole, please.
Well, thanks so much for both of these papers. What a rich set of presentations. And I have one question that might bring things together a little. Sal, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the changing nature and definition and etymology of sweetness and its derivatives. And I looked up sweetener as a contractual term, and it appears in the mid 1600s, right around when you're writing. But the question that brings, I think, your presentations together is I'm really wondering about how sweet is used atmospherically and subjectively in Shakespeare's time. So for example, they'll say, I think in Edward III, there's a line, let's sweet the air of France. And in one of the Henry plays, there's a reference to sweet air, again in reference to bellicosity and conflict with the French. So it's really imbued with patriotism and not whiteness, but with a kind of patriotic ardor. And then there's also sweet to the sweet. And, it's imbued with this idea of ephemerality, subjectivity, and patriotism. Versus much later, you have that folks saying the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, and this notion of blackness as a sweetness that can't be eradicated. And I'm even thinking about a connection between that and something like J.D. Vance's recent comment about how drinking Diet Mountain Dew, which is with, artificial sweeteners, is seen as racist. So I'm really wondering about, is there something to this notion of a move from sweetener and sweetness as something more ephemeral and changeable to something that's more integral and directly kind of connected to that notion of corporeality? Thanks.
That's a really interesting question. First of all, thank you I didn't realize that sweetener on a contract appeared that early. That is fascinating. So thank you for that tip. Yeah, it's the thing that is so tricky about sweetness as a category is that, of course, right, it's like, it's such a capacious word that it's usable to index so many kinds of pleasure. Right, like something pleasurable, something healthy often. I think that's a more 17th century meaning, that sweetness and health are associated, which is like not the contemporary discourse. But that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about air in Shakespeare, but you're right. That's and I'm also thinking of like that and the spiced Indian air and Midsummer Night's Dream. So I'm wondering, I will say that I don't believe Ligon ever talks about air as sweet, although I could go back through it and see. It's really very much about, it's about tasting the sweet, but it's using like the really embodied sense of consumption, but as a metaphor for something like profit. I would be interested to know how specific that is to him and how generalizable that is. But I think, this is why I'm really influenced by Kim Hall's work on sugar, and I think she is really looking at sort of how the increased prevalence and sort of significance of sugar over the course of the 17th century really changes what sweetness means. So I think if I were going to historicize it, like that's maybe what I would say is the difference between this mid 17th century moment and the earlier Shakespearean moment. But that's a provisional answer. It's a really interesting question. I would love to think more about that.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. I actually would really like to think about sweetness and error a bit more too, in part because everything that all the atmospheres I'm thinking about are incredibly turbulent and conflictual. So this is a nice contrast. I appreciate the comment.
Thank you. Sarah, please.
Thanks to both of you for the fantastic papers. I really learned a lot from them. I wanted to ask a question to both of you about money, and how money fits into your conceptual research in these projects. For Sal, I was wondering if you could say more about the preface to Ligon's work and the fact that he's indebted when he's imagining and projecting or regretting the lack of this property that he claims to have been swindled from, or I read it quickly. I don't quite know, but I feel like indebtedness is profoundly implicated in your work on sweetness, and I just would be really interested to hear more about that, particularly the fact that his body has been seized for debt. But money, I wondered if it is so atmospheric, and if so, how, in the ways that you're conceptualizing your approach also, Renisa. Thanks.
Do you want to go first this time, since I did last time?
Sure. That's a really interesting question. So I don't know if I would so I'll just say that in the work that I'm doing, I'm writing a short book on the laws of the sea and anti-Blackness. And so money is like really central to that project, about, the development of shipping, the trade in enslaved people and in cattle and in maritime insurance. But I haven't thought of money as atmospheric. And my initial sort of response is that no, I think it actually has a profound effect on the atmosphere or on atmospheres. And we certainly see that with changing forms of or changing technologies, from conquest to industrialization forward. So, but I'd like to think a bit more about the atmosphere money connection. Sal?
Yeah, and I can say, so a few things about money and Ligon. One is that his debt is unrelated to Barbados. His debt it's a little complicated, and I'm actually digging into his legal records right now, so TBD. But there's two issues. One is that a lot of what he was like the younger son of a younger son. So he spent his whole life being kind of a professional hanger-on to wealthier, more powerful men. And I think that, really inflects his sense of like wounded entitlement, like throughout. And one of the things he would do is become executors to people's wills and then administer those wills. His debt seems to have emerged from that he's the executor of the will of somebody who is in debt. And at the same time, this is somebody he went in on with in the 1630s in a failed fen drainage project. So another form of like ecological and extraction and enclosure that is very relevant to Renisa, your work. And the reason the fen drainage project failed, it's the Lindsay level, which the Killigrews, he's related to the Killigrews, invested in, is that the commoners rioted and tore down the drainage works, which happened all the time. So that's Ligon's history of debt, which is deeply connected to all of this. And I am interested in, in the longer piece, I want to go into that in a lot more detail. But the other thing that sort of I already knew, but is really clear as I'm going through 17th century Caribbean legislative records, is that, sugar is used as currency all the time in the 17th century Caribbean. They had, a real shortage of coin, not just there, but throughout the empire. But they are constantly using sugar as a currency. And so a lot of, like, to the extent that the standard fees for various legal and procedural things are like pounds of sugar rather than any currency. They used tobacco, they used other commodities too, but like sugar was literally money. And so I don't know what to make of that, but that's another, I think, like, sugar becomes really multivalent in that sense too. And yeah, debt is everywhere in these legislative records. It's something I've been struck by, and is something I want to go into more as I continue to read. They are very worried about debtors escaping and debtors running away. And so surveillance of debtors is also it's happening alongside the surveillance of enslaved and indentured laborers. And again, like, indenture could be a punishment for debt, which is analogous to a debtor's prison, but not the same thing. And so I'm very interested in debt here.
Yeah, that's really nice. Melissa, please.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you both for two fantastic papers. I had a very quick thought about the sweetness question that occurred to me as well. Immediately the phrase sweetness and light came to mind, riffing on as well Nicole's observation. And I just did a very quick Google search because I don't even, remember in detail what exactly Arnold was suggesting. But the interesting thing I just learned is apparently he lifted the phrase from Swift, which would be, be more contemporaneous for your project. So anyway, just some idea to throw out. My question for you, you really kind of started to touch upon it at the end of your last response. I was curious if you could maybe give us a little preview of what you're finding in your current research in the archives on the legal codes, and how you were thinking of connecting that with your great reading of Ligon.
Yeah, I have been finding, I'll preface this is not systematic. I have, it's a short archive trip, so I have hundreds of pages of photographs to transcribe later. But a lot of what I'm trying to trace is, part of it is this is a very semantic, like, it's a simple semantic question, but it's something that I don't think historians have settled, which is like, when does the word white actually emerge as a racial descriptor, when and where? And there's a lot of speculation. Like, one historian places, I think it was Nancy Shoemaker, who speculates that it's 1650s Barbados, but she's citing Ligon. And actually just yesterday, I found a 1644 Antigua law that says the phrase white man, which is very early. That's the earliest I've seen, but there's very possibly earlier, I don't know, that is about regulating sex and reproduction between Christians and heathens. And so that leads me, one of the things that I'm noticing, I think where I'm going is futurity reproduction. We all know the centrality of reproduction to racial slavery. And one of the things that I've been noticing as the kind of legal counterpart is the intense anxiety around reproduction among white female indentured servants, because indentured servitude is not hereditary, and therefore their reproduction poses a very different set of like legal and economic problems. So I want to trace that. I don't know where that's going. Yeah, mostly I've been trying, and I've also been trying to track, it seems pretty, and again, the historiography is already there, but I want to track in a bit more detail. A lot of these legal codes, they don't arise in a sort of systematic fashion. They're sort of usually in response to, oh, a rebellion happened, so we're gonna, and I think this speaks to Renisa, your interest in sort of really insisting on the history of resistance that is everywhere in these archives. But I don't yet have, I don't have systematic findings yet. I am mostly trying to just trace, like, where does something like whiteness emerge, even as, of course, status and free or unfree status, which is not analogous to race in this moment, but is becoming racialized. Like, we know the broad strokes of that, and I want to see if I can get some more specific details. Oh, and also the one other thing, that 1644 Antigua law specifies slavery as not being inherited by the child of the mother, which is fascinating and very strange to me. So that's not the case in Barbados at the same time. So that I'm curious about and want to know more what's going on. So that's a tiny preview.
Well, what a fantastic question, and what a great point to end on. So thanks to both of you for wonderful talks. I will just remind everyone we've got two coming up in September. One is the postponed talk on Monica Huerta's book, which we've rescheduled, and also the postponed trio of poets on law, which has also been rescheduled, both for September. So I hope to see some of you there. And thanks to everyone for coming, and particularly to Sal and Renisa for those wonderful talks. Hope to see you all
Thank you
soon.
for your questions. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.